Welcome to Time for Diplomacy. This podcast series is organized by the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro. It is an opportunity to host distinguished theorists and practitioners of international relations in order to get their perspectives on contemporary diplomacy. Hope you will enjoy this episode.
Dear listeners, welcome to the new episode of podcast series Time for Diplomacy, which is organized within the Summer School for Young Diplomats Gavro Vukovic, a flagship project of the Montenegrin Foreign Ministry. This project lays a particular emphasis on the role and significance of diplomacy in maintaining international peace and security, overcoming crises, and developing new models of economic, political, and security cooperation in the international arena. We are pleased that some of the 14 summer school speakers will join us to this podcast series and share their thoughts on contemporary diplomacy and international relations. During today's 20 minutes episode, we'll have a pleasure to discuss possible paths of development of the Ukraine-Russia crisis and possible implications it may have in the Balkans. Our guest today is Professor Edward P. Joseph, a senior fellow and adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. As foreign policy analyst, he has been published in all major outlets, including Foreign Affairs. His article, The Balkans Interrupted, was selected as one of the best of 2015. In his dozens years in Balkans, Mr. Joseph served in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, and Macedonia, where he learned well our language, but even more importantly, he became one of the best policy analysts who specialize in the Balkans region. He also has a file experience from some of the most challenging locations, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and many more. Professor Joseph, welcome to Time for Diplomacy.
Nina, thank you very much. I am pleased to join you and your listeners and the Diplomatic Academy again here, and I'm very grateful to be with all my friends in Montenegro and listeners around the world. Please.
Thank you. On February 24th, the world woke up with the news on the escalation of the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, which caused prompt reaction of the international community. What is your perception on Ukraine-Russia crisis? What are the causes that led to the current situation? And did the crisis in Ukraine surprise the international community, or something like that was expected?
Nina, thank you. Very interesting question. And to each of your questions, I'm going to try to be very precise and clear for our listeners. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the second part of the question initially, which is, was this expected? And then the first part, which is the causes, which is a very important question, I'm going to address that second. So was it expected? Of course it was expected. Not only was it expected, it was clearly predicted. This is one of the really striking elements of this conflict, is the fact that the United States, in an unprecedented way, not only shared intelligence privately with its allies, obviously also sharing this information with Ukraine, which is not a NATO ally, but clearly alerting and informing the Ukrainian government led by President Zelensky of what it knew, but also sharing this publicly. So the Biden administration took special efforts, really in some ways unprecedented, to let the public know that this invasion was coming. And they did it with purpose to diminish the possibility, first, of any surprise, and second, to diminish the ability of Russia to claim various pretexts, such as a false flag incident where a supposed Ukrainian position attacks, quote, innocent Russians, and thereby justifying, in as the Russians would claim, the invasion, and or otherwise justifying Russia's position that it was only on military maneuvers. And this has succeeded very well the fact that this was not just, again, anticipated, but predicted in several ways. In terms of the public global perception of this event, it is clear that Russia is the culprit. This isn't one of these cases where you get into this, well, you know, they did this and the other side did that, as was actually done by Russia in 2014. There were examples in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and the Donbass, where it muddied the narrative by claiming Russians were under threat. And it was not able to do that. The other thing that it did, and this is, many people don't realize this, the significance of this, it forced Russia into a position, and Belarus, its partner and ally in this, junior partner, is it forced them into blatant lies. So do you remember the picture, even the dictator of Belarus, President Lukashenko, going to the border and saying, what are you, who is talking, this is ridiculous, some type of invasion. And then the invasion came. So now, in terms of the information perception, the United States and its allies have great global credibility, and Russia and its partner have very little credibility. And that's very, very important for managing this conflict and hopefully bringing what is still very dangerous conflict with potential implications far beyond Ukraine, bringing it to a close. It's crucial, that bit, the fact that this was predicted. Now, the causes, look, in our time together here, we don't have time to explore the deep history of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian identity and Russia and the Russian identity and decisions made under in the Soviet Union by Khrushchev. And so we don't have time to delve into that. But it's relevant for our discussion. And if you'll permit me, it's very relevant for the Balkans. Why? Because there are disputes about history very much affecting Balkan countries, and in fact, all over Europe, not just in Ukraine and Russia and Baltic states, but and in the Balkans, but all over Europe. There are these different narratives, and even still, even in Europe, different grievances. Just a couple of examples. Look at Austria and Italy, where you have Austrian and German spoken in Bolzano, what the Austrians call Sud Tiro, but the Italians call it Alto Adige. And you still have legacy claims and differences. Look at Croatia and Italy. In Istria, where Italian is spoken across the border, and some people have more of an Italian identity. And even Italy, to some extent, still has a traditional legacy vision, perhaps, of Istria, and even a city like Rijeka, which in Italian is fiume, means river, Rijeka, fiume. So you have these all over, you have these historical claims. There's nothing unique about the Russian claim and perception here. These are all over. What is important is how they are addressed. And there is simply no basis for the Russian claim that it's that Russian, either as you like, ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine are under some kind of quote genocidal threat. This is simply not the case. And viewers must understand that this is not just an opinion of mine, some American academic based at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington. No, this element of the condition of Russia speakers in Ukraine is a subject of OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which Russia and the United States are both members of. There are Russians who are members of the OSCE monitors in there. So this area is subject by agreement of Russia to international monitoring. So there's simply no basis and no claim and no justification for Russia's invasion. And so that's what we can say about the causes. The causes are really, we have to pinpoint them. It's not some deep underlying historical thing that is unique to here. And it's not due to some kind of threat that, oh, these poor Russian speakers are under and have to be rescued. This is false. This is a false narrative. It's demonstrably false, as I said, from Russian agreement in an international monitoring mission. And finally, I have to say one more thing that this is not about, Nina. This is, the cause is not, I repeat, not due to NATO expansion. And this is very important, Nina, to say, because this narrative that somehow NATO and the United States in particular share in the blame for this is an argument that is made not only by Russia, but also by China. It is used overtly. Even just last week, the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs made the same argument, blaming the United States as well and NATO for NATO expansion. And you have many respected commentators in the United States who make this same argument themselves. And it's wrong, it's a mistake, and we see it's dangerous. It confuses people, and it dilutes the clear Russian responsibility, wholesale responsibility for this. And Nina, I just closed by explaining quickly why this is not the case. If someone says, well, I don't understand that. NATO did expand and that made Russia, humiliated Russia. This is a false rendering of the history. First of all, there was no categorical promise by either President Bush Sr. or President Clinton ever that NATO would not be expanded. There was no such categorical promise ever made. There were initial promises. They had to do with basing in what was East Germany. And second, President Yeltsin and President Clinton discussed this. There were advisors of President Clinton who provided clear information about what U.S. intentions were about this. Russia was consulted, and Russia was given privileged position, more privileged than any other former East Bloc country. There was a special NATO-Russia Council created. There was the NATO-Russia Founding Act. There, of course, were some mistakes made, of course, some mistakes, but there is no way to characterize and say that NATO expansion was a breach of some promise, and nor was there, was there any intention to demean or encircle Russia by NATO expansion? And we can know this simply by looking at the record. Do we see any NATO member that has taken advantage of its NATO membership to abuse ethnic Russians, for example, in the Baltics, to prevent Russia, for example, to have access to Kaliningrad, it's by Lithuania, for example? Do we see NATO making threats, as President Putin claims? No, to the opposite. And I'm going to close here with a very pointed example of the opposite. It is Russia that has undermined the security, not only of Ukraine in the most brutal and blatant way, but a country, Nina, like yours, Montenegro, with the attempted coup in that country to prevent Montenegro from its own sovereign right to decide if it wants to join the NATO assembly. And it's not only in Montenegro. We've seen the Kremlin has conspired with separatists in Catalonia, in Spain. It collaborates with hybrid warfare, with disinformation throughout Europe to create divisions and confusion. It's even citing and promoting the separation of Scotland from the United Kingdom. So these is the reality that we face. The real cause, to answer your question, Nina, is in the Kremlin and in the person of an autocrat, a dictator named Vladimir Putin. Please.
Thank you very much for providing elaborated examples and, for putting the ongoing crisis into a rather clear historical and international perspective. Bearing in mind your experience from some of the most challenging locations, what are some possible paths of development of this situation?
Well, the situation remains very perilous. First of all, it remains most perilous, of course, for the citizens of Ukraine and for Ukrainian sovereignty. So that's the first possible implications. The second concern will just go out in like a circle. If we can picture Ukraine on a map, we'll go out from that. It concerns Ukraine's neighbors like Poland, Romania, Slovakia, the Baltic states, Moldova, which is a non-NATO member, the only bordering country besides Belarus that is not a member of NATO. And these countries are being presented with a very serious refugee crisis, hundreds of thousands of refugees. This is really a refugee crisis almost unprecedented in its speed, over 3 million refugees. So this is the second very serious implication. This, even though in most cases, other than Moldova, these are members of the European Union and members of NATO states, this is still an incredible influx. This is, at this point, has already exceeded the total number of refugees displaced in all the Balkans conflicts in the 1990s. So that's a second. The third is there are security concerns here, and these involve not just the NATO countries, but all countries in Europe and as well all NATO members, and should, but doesn't really concern really the wider world. And we can see very disappointingly in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, of course, China, and in across much of Africa. There's ambivalence about this, which is really quite foolish, Nina, because there are such serious dangers here. People think, oh, well, this is not our fight. This was the word, for example, President Duterte of Philippines said, this is not our fight. Oh, yes? You'd think so? And Mr. President, well, already there's massive food insecurity as a result of Vladimir Putin's aggression, President Duterte. There's a huge inflation risk now. In price of oil has gone up, President Duterte. So you say this is not your fight, really? Because Russia, you have some affinity for Russia, but Russia's decision, which is unprovoked by either Ukraine or the United States or others, is severely affecting the world. And finally, Nina, we should remember the escalation potential for this. This is extremely dangerous. The countries that are bordering Ukraine in particular, and when I say border, I also mean the sea border, which includes Bulgaria and Turkey as well. They have security threats that they're concerned about. Romania, Moldova in particular, is very concerned because there's a Russian-backed separatist regime that is in power in the Transnistria portion. Poland is very concerned because there have been Russian airstrikes in the west part of Ukraine near the Polish border. Now let's imagine, Nina, and our listeners should imagine this. What happens either by intention or even mistake that a Russian munitions cross the border and go into Poland and even potentially, tragically, would kill some Polish citizens? Poland is a member of NATO. There's the Article 5 guarantee. NATO would be forced to react. And then how would Vladimir Putin react to that? This is the concern of this potential ladder of escalation with a country that has nuclear weapons and with a leader who is in a very embattled position because of his gross miscalculations and the incompetence of the Russian army. This is potentially quite serious. So, Nina, those are some of the immediate concerns from this crisis.
What are the possible implications of the ongoing crisis for the Balkans? Do you think that it will accelerate EU and/or NATO integration of Western Balkan countries?
Okay, it's a very interesting question. Again, let's remember that those refugee concerns and the refugee flows and the security concerns already have an impact on the Balkan countries. But Romania is a Balkans country. Bulgaria is a Balkans country. Turkey is a Balkans country. So they're already, these are present in the Balkans. Now, if we speak about the rest of the region, which is not the frontline states, it can have and already has had significant implications. Let's look at this first question, the adherence to the sanctions regime. So we see that most countries in the Balkans have adhered to the sanctions, but Serbia and, if my information is correct, for now, Montenegro has also, Serbia has not adhered by its own clear decision. Montenegro has not adhered by a division in the government, if my information is still correct and up to date. Bosnia-Herzegovina has split and on the issue. Now, why would those three countries, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, why would they not join with the European Union in applying sanctions? After all, each of them, two of them are candidates, and Bosnia-Herzegovina is a aspiring candidate for EU membership. And the answer is clearly in Belgrade. This is where the answer is because of President Alexander Vucic's and his government's strategic partnership, that's a quote, strategic partnership with Russia, the open support and the praise that the government in Belgrade, Serbian government, gives to Vladimir Putin. Do you know, in his time in office, President Vucic has met with President Putin, it's either 18 or 19 times. I believe it is now 19 times that President Vucic in his time in office has met President Putin. That's an extraordinary number of times. This is a relationship that is deep, and it's not just based on convenience like getting Russian gas, it's ideological. It's based on an ideological affinity of an autocratic leader in Belgrade and an autocratic leader and very dangerous regime in Russia. And we know that it's not just this famous Orthodox religion and pan-Slavic connection. We know it's not that because look at the difference in Montenegro, which is a majority Orthodox Christian country, Slavic. Look at North Macedonia, which is majority Orthodox Christian Slavic country in its majority. Neither of those. Look at Greece, which is Orthodox country, not Slavic, but also Orthodox majority. Look at their relationship with Russia. It's very different from Serbia. There's a very different approach, and it has to do with the strategic orientation of these countries, and that Serbia is still oriented to Russia and continues to promote a completely false parallel with the Kosovo 1999 Kosovo Air Campaign, which Vladimir Putin has used, directly applied it into the Ukraine and for Crimea. He sees it as a direct parallel. It is not. It is completely different. Even if one thought the reasons were somehow is similar. Look at the conduct of NATO compared to what Russia is doing. So these are issues that are exploited deliberately by the Vučić government to protect its own interests, its own character as an autocratic regime. And that's very important for your listeners to understand. And as for potential implications, we can see that the space for President Vučić is for him to operate here on this so-called two chairs has narrowed, but it is not gone because there is still a generous position in among some officials, some Western officials have given publicly a very, very generous position for President Vučić to operate. And they have asked relatively little of President Vučić in this crisis. The only thing that Serbia has done in this crisis is to join the vote in the UN General Assembly, which was 141-5, and which was not much of a concession by Serbia because it was simply impossible. It would have stood out as with China in such a glaring and obvious way that it could not maintain the charade that President Vučić has, the charade of actually being interested in making the reforms necessary to join the European Union. So those are some of the main implications that we see. Please.
Thank you very much. It is certainly true that every crisis teaches us some important lessons. What are the ones that Balkans can draw from the Ukraine-Russia crisis?
I'll tell you, Anina, it's a very interesting question. The lessons first have to do with the character of a country. And when we talk about the character, we talk about the citizens, the leaders, and the nature of the government. And the first lesson that we see is that the character and strategic orientation of a country matter enormously. If you are Russia and your character is authoritarian and autocratic, you do autocratic and authoritarian things. And that's very dangerous. And in the Balkans, if you're Serbia and you're authoritarian and autocratic, if you dominate the media, we see in Russia, Russians are not being told the truth. What about in Serbia? The media is almost 95% effectively influenced. I would use the word controlled, but I'm going to be cautious and say influenced. Almost 90% influenced by the government. The picture that Serbian citizens get of the war at first was completely along the Russian lines, and still we see European Union officials who themselves, the European Union ambassador to Serbia himself, Joffre, just recently called on Serbia and criticized the media impression, the disinformation that's being provided to Serbian citizens. So we see regime character matters enormously. If you're democratic, now this is the other part, that's the negative part that comes from this conflict. We see all the negative things coming that spout from an autocratic regime where the leader is only told things that he wants to hear. And let's remember how incompetent the Russian military is. And this should be a lesson for countries in the region. Serbia, which prides itself on this strategic partnership with Russia and with China, and which gets a lot of weapons from Russia. Look at the incompetence of the Russian military. This should be a lesson to Serbia, which of course matters far less to Russia and Vladimir Putin than does Ukraine, and is much further away from Ukraine. Russia cannot even provide fuel for its own tanks and its own vehicles in a neighboring country. What is it actually going to do for Serbia with these weapons that it's providing Serbia if Serbia were to be so reckless as to engage in some conflict in either Kosovo or supporting Milorad Dodik in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or even, let's hope not, even in Montenegro? What is Russia going to do? What about these Russian weapon systems? Look how poorly. What about all the spare parts that are needed to maintain them? So these are some of the lessons. These are sort of the negative lessons that we can see from association with Russia. But let's look at the positive side, the positive lessons across the Balkans. Let's look at Ukraine. Let's look first at, again, strategic orientation, the difference between Russia and Ukraine. Look at Ukraine by its own decision, not because the United States did some and the European Union were so eager and trying to encircle Russia. This clearly, the European Union doesn't really care that much for enlargement. We know that in the Balkans, it doesn't. It certainly has no eagerness to bring in Ukraine as a member, but it's the expressed desire of the Ukrainian people and their democratically elected leadership to join the European Union. It's that attraction. And let's remember, very important, Nina, for all your listeners to remember that this entire crisis in 2014 began not because of anything that NATO did, not because of the 2008 commitment that in Bucharest that one day Ukraine and Georgia would be members. This crisis started in 2014 because of a potential association agreement with the European Union. Not NATO had nothing to do with NATO. It was all about the European Union. It had nothing to do with NATO. And we know Serbia, for example, has a EU candidacy and has no interest in joining NATO. So we know countries can proceed along an EU path without a NATO membership path. And so we see that the difference, this is the express desire. And for countries in the Balkans, this is a lesson to see Ukrainians are dying, literally dying, and as they protested in 2014, to maintain their sovereign right to be free and to choose which way they want to go. And for those in the Balkans who are now disappointed and say, well, you know, what does it matter? I understand the disappointment, but this should be a lesson for those people. Second lesson from Ukraine, citizen responsibility. Yes, many Ukrainians have fled because of the fighting, but many have stayed. Many more have stayed and are fighting, and we see that. And we know that these are not just people who don't have the means to leave Ukraine. We see even sports stars and celebrities of Ukrainians who are there fighting. Some of their top tennis players, this is fact, documented, have come back, even though they have all the money to live in Western Europe that they need comfortably, have come back to fight for the country. This should be inspiring for the people of the Balkans to take citizen responsibility, not to take up arms. There's no need to do that. But what this should inspire is to take up citizen activism. And we've seen that it can work, even in a country like Serbia, where citizen environmental protests have changed and stopped the autocratic government of Alexander Vukovic from environmentally degrading projects. This is what should inspire and be a lesson to citizens in Montenegro and its neighbors to get involved and to work and to use democratic rights to ensure that there's scrutiny and accountability of the government on issues like corruption and human rights. So that is a lesson. And more widely, this should be a lesson for the United States and the European Union. Thank you very much, Nina.
Professor Joseph, we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us on these important issues. This podcast series is part of the project supported by NATO Public Diplomacy Division, whom we are particularly thankful for having recognized the program of summer school as conducive to Euro-Atlantic agenda for a more secure and prosperous world. We also owe a special gratitude to our long-standing partners, UNDP Montenegro.
This podcast series is a part of Summer School for Young Diplomats Gavro Vukovic project, the global platform that brings together young diplomats from all over the world and provides opportunities for learning, sharing, and networking.